Hi, everybody. This is my mini lecture for week 6, also chapter 6 of the Kettle Book. And a few of you have told me that you enjoy these mini lectures, so I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad that they're helpful to you. Um, and as typical, this lecture, mini lecture, supplements the Kettle reading, but does not replace the Kettle reading. So let me get right into that. Okay, a couple things. Look at point number 2. I am telling myself and telling you that I'm trying to keep this mini lecture more mini than typical, meaning I don't plan to spend that much time on it. I only have a few slides here, really, because I want you to get into the reading yourselves. This is a rich chapter, so really it's important that you read this chapter. And listed as number 1 here, this presentation does contain some of my opinions, and of course, you're certainly welcome to dispute my opinion. In fact, I'd be happy if you did. Although I think most of what I say here is based in fact. So let me get right into this and discuss some of the points that I think are particularly important. Okay, so what are Kittle's major points here? We've been talking about these 4 traditions of Hamiltonianism, Jeffersonianism, Madisonianism, Wilsonianism, these 4 traditions that Kittle has presented as really kind of the intellectual pillars of public administration. And indeed, I agree with him that these traditions do form something of the intellectual foundation of the study of public administration. And they're very important. And again, it's really important that you understand in general what these traditions purport to say. Not only does it enrich you as a public administrator, but as I've said before, it makes you really fun at a party. Um, so what he's saying here, though, is that the 4 traditions have had somewhat uh, difficulty, had a difficult time really explaining what has evolved into the 21st century and into the world that we live in now. And why is that? Because Kettle points to these twin forces of what he calls devolution and globalization. He doesn't just call them this, a lot of people do. Um, and the 4 traditions, because they have focused on and have been concerned with what government is and how it should respond, and they haven't focused on what is called governance. It's difficult for the 4 traditions to explain the modern world of governance, because governance and government are distinctly different from each other, although they're related. They describe different things. Governments act with authority. So let's talk about all governments here, really, um, from the federal government to your state government for the state you live in to the city government of the city you live in. You might not even live in a incorporated area of a city, um, but you probably have a board that has some taxing authority, and that's a government. A school board is a government. So all governments act with some authority, often sovereign authority, what we think of as sovereign authority, um, as in a nation state, and to create this set of formal obligations with other, let's say, policy actors and bring about policy outcomes. But on the other hand, what we would call governance really is a description of a process. It describes the processes and the institutions, whether formal or informal, to bring about policy outcomes. So governance is going to describe a whole set of actors in the policy arena, not just the government, if you will, but other actors as well. So I've given this example before, but in uh, Omaha is typical i- as a city in that it has homelessness in the city, and most cities in the United States do. But do cities directly resolve or attempt to resolve that issue? And the answer is typically no. Um, Cities may invest some of their money, that is, taxpayer dollars, to to mitigate or solve the problem of homelessness, but they are going to act through nonprofits, sometimes through for-profits. Um, they're going to act through nonprofits that are non-sectarian in nature, that are sectarian in nature. These nonprofits are going to get funding from, for example, the city, but they might also get funding from federal sources. They might get funding from donations and typically would. So what is a city doing in that sense? A city is part of a network trying to govern or manage this problem of homelessness. So what's the difference? Well, for one thing, accountability is a big difference, right? So uh, in the Wilsonian model or the Wilsonian tradition of government, we look to professional administrators to carry out the policies of elected leaders. And those elected leaders can hold those managers responsible when things go right or wrong. Um, but in the case of governance, who do we hold accountable? Again, in this example I gave, um, if a homeless person, for example, is uh, is found, I'll get really kind of, I don't mean to be crude here, but say a homeless person is found to be dead. Um, well, so were they in the care of the city if they were outside this shelter when they died? Were they in the care of this nonprofit? I mean, who's accountable for it? Is anyone in charge? Is someone in charge? And the other problem with comparing government and governance is, this is my opinion, that this word government is kind of in our cultural DNA, right? We like to give government tasks to do. So way back when, in the early 1960s, when President John F. Kennedy said, "It is our intent to put a man on the moon within this decade." And in fact, that was done. In 1969, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. Well, that was a government agency, NASA, getting that job done. And so that was a huge task. Now, let me go back and say that government agency, NASA, had a whole lot of contractors working for it. Um, but we also like to assign blame to government when things go wrong, right? You drive your car to work and you run over a bunch of potholes and it throws your car out of alignment and you're angry and you say, why can't the city fix the potholes? So, in my opinion, this whole idea of government is in our cultural DNA, both for credit and for blame. So, I want to spend the rest of the time just talking about a couple of terms in this chapter, and really, I have about 3 slides ahead. That's it. The rest of it, I really want to leave it up to you to read the chapter. So what is this term devolution? Well, simply put, this term means that responsibility for programs are devolved or assigned to lower levels or collateral levels of government or non-government, if you will. So what are some examples of this? And Kittle uses this example in the book, and it's a particularly good example. Um, you know, Medicaid is a program that um, pays for health care for people who don't have the means to do so. Their income is below a certain level. Um, but it's a federal program, right? But about 43% of Medicaid expenditures are in fact made by the states, not by the federal government. That's a pretty big chunk. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is a government organization, part of the federal government, that's about a $230 billion program. Okay, $230 billion program between Medicare and Medicaid expenditures. That is actually about a third, a little bit better than a third of the defense budget, with only 4,300 employees. Okay, so I will assure you that the Defense Department is much bigger than 13,000 employees to spend about $650 billion a year. Well, how does the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services do this? It's simply by devolution through third-party companies, mostly insurance companies that manage reimbursements, through a network of healthcare providers, doctors, surgeons, uh, assisted living facilities, skilled nursing facilities who understand the system and, and I would say profit from it. And as mentioned earlier, the states. So this is really a great example of devolution. It is a huge, huge expenditure for the federal government and for state governments, but really it's this, this is run through a whole network of organizations, some of which are government, some of which are nonprofit, some of which are for profit. The Affordable Care Act, and I say, dare I bring this up, because we've had some lively discussions about the Affordable Care Act. So here we go. I even put that in here. Dr. Jim Harrold's take here, just to make sure you know I'm uttering my opinion here and you don't have to go along with me. So whether you think the ACA was some kind of heroic effort by the federal government to provide health care to everyone, or it's an example of some kind of socialistic government overreach, in reality, in my opinion, it's neither. I mean, some people have described the ACA not as government overreach, but as insurance company takeover of healthcare. So if the ACA had actually worked as designed, and one of the reasons it never has worked as designed is because of a couple of court challenges that threw certain aspects of the law out. Basically, what would happen is that all companies of a certain size, around 50 people, would have been required to offer health insurance. That doesn't mean free health insurance, but some kind of health insurance plan. The premiums, no doubt, would have been shared. Um, all individuals would have been required to have health insurance or be penalized. So those are two things I just said there, the employer mandate and the individual mandate. And then insurance companies would be able to sell insurance in state-run marketplaces. So all these marketplaces you hear about were really designed to be run by the states. And so insurance companies were supposed to be able to sell three levels of insurance, bronze, silver, and gold to individuals. And the federal government would also reimburse the states for the additional Medicaid expenses that were going to be incurred because Medicaid was supposed to have been expanded to cover people whose income was below 133% of the federal poverty level to assist them in buying insurance. So actually, what happened was the ACA never ever worked as designed. Um, and insurance premiums have continued to go up. Whether they would have continued to go up or not is anybody's guess. They probably would have, in my opinion. I mean, even President Obama himself said the goal was to what he called bend the cost curve. He didn't really say that the goal was to make premiums less than they were. Um, Insurance premiums have been going up faster than wages for about the last 15 years or more. But in effect, whether you think the ACA is great or whether you think the ACA completely stinks, it really is the ultimate devolution because the responsibility for executing it was going to be spread again through various levels of government and through for profits, through providers, through insurance companies. It was the ultimate devolution. Okay, so what's this term globalization? Um, well, Kettle talks about uh, globalization as a movement, as markets, as an ideology. So here's another personal opinion here. So without revealing, who I voted for during the last election, because it's not important who I voted for, it was amusing to me, though, that one candidate who described himself as a democratic socialist, Bernie Sanders, and a different candidate who identified himself as a, highly successful businessman, Donald Trump, both denounced the evils of globalization. And in my opinion, both of them seem to indicate that the United States was going to go back to the 1950s, post World War II, where in fact the United States was this really the sole global manufacturing and for most purposes the sole global banking power in the world. Um, you know, that's interesting. In terms of international relations, so what's happened with globalization? Three things, really. In terms of international relations, it is much harder for nations to go it alone or even be willing to go it alone. I mean, our wars in Iraq or Afghanistan were not American wars. We had partners. We had a lot of partners. They were different sets of partners, and some of the partners were the same. But, in Iraq and continuing in Afghanistan, these are coalition wars. The war in Syria is this very confusing array of interlocking alliances between nation states like the United States, um, and Turkey and Syria, which is still theoretically a nation state, and Russia, a nation state, and other organizations like self-proclaimed terrorist organizations. ISIS calls itself a terrorist organization. Al Qaeda calls itself a terrorist organization. Resistance fighters, some of whom are supported by the United States, some of whom are supported by Russia, some of whom are supported by Turkey. Um, we have resistance fighters who are supported by the United States but not supported by Turkey, but yet Turkey and the United States are both NATO allies. Local populations, some cities in Syria support the Assad regime, some cities in Turkey oppose the Assad, or in Syria oppose the Assad regime, and even non-government organizations that are operating in Syria, like the International Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, organizations trying to do humanitarian work. So it's what I call a dizzying array. It's not the good guys and the bad guys. It's really this interlocking international order, if you will. In terms of markets, so how does one stop financial markets from acting globally 24/7? So you can buy stock 24/7 right now. You can buy stock in international corporations, you can buy stock in foreign corporations. Nobody's going to stop you from doing that. But writ large, that is very important because what that means is money is moving, literally, money is moving all over the globe. And how does one prevent international corporations from locating for tax purposes in one nation, manufacturing their product in another, and selling their products where the demand is? So, in case you're missing this, I'm describing the Apple Corporation here, which for tax purposes says it's located in Ireland. It manufactures their product, most of their iPhones, in China, and it sells their products where the demand is, which is the United States. How do you stop Apple from doing that? And as an ideology, we can get into more interesting discussions. And this is perhaps why during our last election cycle in 2016, both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump scored points with people, right? Because they said each of them said a couple of things. They said our national sovereignty was diminished by globalization, and they said that our workers were losing out because of globalization. And so that becomes attractive to voters. Um, and it is true that globalization does, to a certain extent, diminish national sovereignty. So, the point is, my point, and again, my opinion, I think globalization just is. I don't think you actually in globalization, and I'm not convinced globalization is a bad thing for Americans or American workers. It might be. I mean, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump might have both been right. But again, I'm presenting a lot of my opinions here, and I'm allowing you to take issue with me. That's just fine. So what are the implications? Well, these are implications to me, and again, I'm packing this thing full of a lot of my perspectives, but please recognize them as my perspectives. One is, I think it behooves us as graduate students, as educated people, to kind of quit blaming government for all your problems, and quit easily accepting the arguments of those who do, because in fact the world is a lot more complicated than that. Governments at all levels share responsibility for execution of programs. That's devolution. Governments at all levels have both what I call strategic and perhaps accidental partnerships. Governments go out to make partners of for profits, uh, of nonprofits to carry out things, but they might have accidental partnerships as well, partners that they didn't really plan on. Certain nonprofits or non-governmental organizations that are carrying out parts of programs that they didn't even realize. Um, Governments at all levels are affected by and sometimes encourage globalization. In my home state of Nebraska, the governor, not just this governor, but several past governors, both parties, have encouraged trade deals with other nations. So the governors of Nebraska like to visit other countries, and they're not unique. Other governors do the same thing. Well, the governors of Nebraska like to do that because they want to establish markets primarily for our agricultural products, because Nebraska is a heavily agriculture uh, uh, based state. And devolution and globalization intersect. So, one of the really emotional issues over the past several years has been whether this thing called the Keystone Pipeline should be built across Nebraska, specifically across an area called the Sandhills. But here's some of the parties involved in these arguments back and forth. The U.S. State Department, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the state of Nebraska, the government of Alberta, province in Canada, the TransCanada Corporation, which is a Canadian corporation, but it's a corporation nevertheless. Unions, which are, by the way, have been traditionally Democratic supporters, but one union, pipe fitters, for example, they want the work, so they'd like the pipeline to go through. Landowners who do or do not want a pipeline crossing their land in Nebraska. And many of those landowners are traditionally Republicans who have said, no, I don't want this pipeline to come across my land. Um, but this is a great example of how devolution and globalization really intersect. And so the answers to everything are just not that simple. So, what is the implication for us as public administrators, right? That's what you're all training to be. What's the implication for us as public administration people? One is, most government bureaucracies still at the federal level, the state level, the local levels really do remain structured and staffed to manage traditional direct government provision of policy outcomes. So the traditional hierarchy, which people criticize the bureaucracy, that really does exist and probably deserves the criticism that people level at bureaucracies, because that kind of structure really is not designed to manage complex relationships and networks. So, challenge number one, according to Kittle, is adaptation. So, that means that we have to fit this traditional bureaucratic vertical organization into this world of globalization and devolution, and recognize that the horizontal nature of governance is really what we should be pursuing. Second challenge is capacity. So when I say capacity, what I mean is abilities and resources, and probably education. Do we have the ability to strategically manage networked governance? Do we educate our public administrators to be able to do that? And challenge three, scale. I mean, some problems really are of the scale that governments at various levels should be handling them, but some aren't. And how do we know that for sure? So for example, yeah, you know what? Managing K-12 education, really, people argue about federal involvement. It's actually a pretty good fit for a state government to manage K-12 education. Um, and in fact, uh, protestations otherwise, most K-12 education really remains a state domain. Um, but what about things like international banking laws, the movement of money billions of dollars every day? Um, are nation states really equipped to impose laws that conflict with each other when the money is moving every day anyway? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but it's something to think about. So here's a blank slide. And again, as I've said, this presentation does have a lot of my perspectives, but I want you to think about your own perspectives as you read this chapter from Kettle, and going forward, really, as public administrators, you're going to be facing these kinds of challenges. And I really just want to plant that seed in your mind of how you act and you manage moving forward. So thanks for listening up to this point. I'm looking forward to your participation this week. Thank you.